What's with HMs? You know, the HMs in Pokémon, where you're pretty much required to teach one of your Pokémon a very inconvenient move that you're often stuck with for the rest of the game. Why did they force us to use these moves? Aren't the games so much better now that they're gone? And most importantly, what's with them? Well, HMs, which stands for Hidden Machines, were introduced in the first Pokémon games, Pokémon Red and Blue. At the time, they weren't a huge inconvenience because there were only 5 of them: Cut, Fly, Surf, Strength, and Flash. 4 of these moves would be used in specific environmental conditions to progress through the world, mostly through caves and oceans. The last one was mostly just a convenience. In a way, the HMs were a very novel idea. Imagine you're going through the world when you come across this tree. You might realize that you'll have to come back here at this point, and then later, once you get the power to cut trees, you'll think, oh, I remember that place way back. I bet I can cut that tree down now. And sure enough, you can. This makes the whole world feel more open and vast. Instead of going from one town to the next on some linear path, you might need to backtrack to previous locations to open new pathways. Not only that, but the need to have all HMs on hand would influence players to try new things. If you're at a large buffet with all sorts of food you've never seen before, it might be a waste to only try what you're used to. Similarly, in a world with 151 Pokemon, being closed-minded about which ones you get might be kinda silly. The HMs push players to try new things they otherwise wouldn't, and this would regularly assist in more ways than you may have noticed. For example, the Fire-type gym leader is on an island. In order to get to that island, you need to travel across water using the move Surf. This means you probably have a Water-type Pokemon that knows the move Surf. Having a Water-type Pokemon would definitely help in battling the Fire-type gym leader. This is just one example of how HMs work to organically assist the player throughout the game. What a lot of people probably don't realize is just how drastically the HMs likely influence the Pokemon that were made in the game. For example, of all the types of Pokemon in the game, there's a much larger quantity of water types than any other, and by a wide margin. This has been true in every single generation. Although Surf can be used by more than just water types, I theorize that the designers intentionally made a certain number of water types so that by the time the player gets access to Surf, they'll definitely have something that can learn it. Moreover, once the player is surfing, the designers may have wanted to continue giving the player new Pokemon to see, so it makes sense that they'd add even more water types to encounter in the water. Note that this is just conjecture, but I think it seems reasonable. In Generation 1, the games weren't entirely nuanced, so HMs didn't cause a whole lot of trouble. Unfortunately, over time, Game Freak's desire to expand on HMs as a mechanic would lead to some rough outcomes. The second generation of Pokemon jumped from 5 to 7 HMs, adding Whirlpool and Waterfall. The big problem with these moves is that they're both water-type. In order to reliably progress through any place in the world, you need to have 3 of your move slots taken up by water-type moves. Due to the fact that not all Pokemon can learn every move, this typically entailed having just one Water-type Pokemon that knew all 3 Water-type HMs, which really hurt its ability to fight. After all, Surf deals the most damage, and while the other 2 moves have their upsides when compared to Surf, the in-game battles rarely became deep enough to require their use. The HM count continued to go up, even peaking at 8 in Generation 4. Fans were visibly upset because the HM seemed to be getting more and more contrived over time. For example, Defog is used to remove fog from a location, but it did very little in battle. Moreover, Defog was only used like 1 or 2 times throughout the entire game. It seemed like the games were having HMs just to have HMs, rather than organically leaving the player to try new things like they seemed to in the previous generations. This led a lot of players to have what some would call an HM slave, a Pokemon who's rarely, if ever, put into battle, who only exists on the team to have 4 HMs. Having an HM slave was especially necessary in some locations. For example, in Diamond and Pearl, the main climax of the game took place at Mount Coronet. To traverse this cave, the player needed to have 4 HMs. Moreover, it seems perhaps deliberate that Bibarel, a Pokemon that can learn all 4 of these moves, can be caught in a route adjacent to Mount Coronet. Many were dissatisfied that they had to have an entire 1/6 of their party taken up by an HM slave, especially for the climactic battles of the game. Perhaps in response to the commotion, the HM count started to drop, going straight down to 6 in Generation 5. It continued dropping until Sun and Moon, in which Game Freak made the interesting decision to remove them from the games entirely, replacing them with a different system called Pokeride. For the most part, fans seem to be happy that there are no longer restrictions on their team, but what did this mean for Sun and Moon's world design? In the previous games, finding an environmental hazard without the right HMs forces you to make a decision. Either teach a Pokemon an HM on the spot, or remember to come back later. But Pokeride can be accessed at any time. If you come across a giant boulder or rock, you can always progress as long as you have the correct ride Pokemon. In a way, this can be better because it streamlines the process of finding items, but it also gets rid of a bit of the whimsy behind exploration. You never have to wonder what awaits you because you can always just go right through. Now, some might argue that you can still have that sense of wonder because if you find an environmental hazard before you unlock the ride Pokemon, you'll have to come back later, but the problem is that Sun and Moon clearly weren't designed with that in mind. Throughout the first island, you'll occasionally find these giant rocks in the way, and like in previous games, you might think, I bet I can come back here to open new paths. Sure enough, at the end of the first island, you get Tauros who can break these rocks. But once you have Tauros, rocks serve virtually no mechanical purpose. You can find some rocks in later islands, but since you always have Tauros, you can always progress. Even worse is Mudsdale. The only thing Mudsdale is used for is crossing rocky terrain. But you're never faced with rocky terrain until Route 12, and the moment you're faced with it, the game gives you Mudsdale. And again, unlike with HMs, you always have Mudsdale. You'll never face a rocky terrain that you're forced to come back to later because you always have Mudsdale on you. In a way, there's fundamentally no point in rocky terrain even existing. On the flip side, recall Mount Coronet from Diamond and Pearl. Although this is the location in which the climax takes place, the player travels through the mountain twice earlier in the game. Each time you go through, you see little areas that can't yet be accessed, as they require HMs you don't have. Plus, just looking at the map of the region shows how big Mount Coronet is. You know there's going to be a lot to see in there. When you finally do have all the HMs, it feels especially gratifying to explore these areas. It's emblematic of the growth you've made throughout your journey and opens up new doors to expand your perspective of the world. Sure, the HM requirement was a bit annoying, but it was such a mystical place, and not just because you encountered a legendary Pokemon there. Places like Mount Coronet just feel like so much more of a worldly landmark than, say, the ruins in Sun and Moon. You only travel to these places once with the explicit purpose to catch the legendaries residing there. Despite fixing some of the big issues that HMs caused, Pokeride comes with its own issues. Most notably, it eliminates organic backtracking. The number of locations to which you might want to come back later is far smaller than that of any other game. With constant access to Pokeride, players will see the world all at once in a sort of linear manner. In some ways, the story was designed to put players in previously visited locations now and then, but the systemic approach to the world is thoroughly weakened, so all the backtracking just felt a lot less natural. I wouldn't say that this is intrinsically bad, but it just kind of makes the world a lot less interesting, at least in my opinion. Given the positive reception to Pokeride, I think it's safe to assume that HMs won't be coming back in future games. At least not in the same capacity that they existed in generations 1 through 6. But whatever they do, it's my hopes that the design of the region doesn't suffer for it as it seemed to have in Generation 7. And that's what's with HMs.